Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor, please subscribe if you haven't already. Listen up, because the time has come for a new episode of Rock and Read. Today, you will get to hear Chapter 13 of Runnin With The Devil, written by Van Halen's manager, Noel Monk. Chapter 13 is called Beat It. Here we go. Nobody knows anything, the great novelist and screenwriter William Goldman famously wrote. He was referring to the fickle and forever up movie industry in which he often toiled, but he might just as well have been talking about the music business. Brilliant albums sometimes fail, while albums go platinum. Sometimes there are performers making music so wonderful and yet obscure that their work never sees the light of day. And even for those that do make it, the music industry often remains mystifying. Just when you think you've got everything figured out, they throw you another curveball. As 1981 gave way to 1982, my goal for Van Halen was to do exactly what I said I would do: provide the band enough time and space to craft a truly great album. No more jumping off the road and straight into the studio, and then right back out on the road to support an album that had been furiously cobbled together in the span of a few weeks. Maybe there wouldn't even be an album in 1982, and if there wasn't an album, maybe there wouldn't be a tour, or not much of one anyway. We would rest and recharge our batteries, and take the time to write and record a masterpiece. Or at least, that was the plan. Instead, here's what happened. When the Fair Warning tour ended in late October, everyone took a well-deserved break, one that carried over until the end of the year. There were no plans whatsoever to put together a new album for release in the first quarter of the new year, as we had done the previous 4 years. My job was to protect the band from outside interference and coercion, to shield them from the usual pressure to crank out another album and another tour. On a personal level, I had no desire to put out a product under the Van Halen brand that would require another weight infusion of cash to ensure a platinum sales performance. The way I saw it, the band had been working hard enough and fast enough, and had earned the right to take a more leisurely and artistic approach to the recording process this time around. Leave it to David to scuttle the entire plan. Not that it was exactly his intent. David was an anxious and restless sort by nature, and after a couple months passed, he became concerned about the possibility that Van Halen was beginning to fade from the public consciousness. I found this absurd. They were one of the biggest bands in the world, and a short respite, or even a long one, wasn't going to do anything to compromise that position, at least not in my view. If anything, a hiatus might have fueled an even greater hunger for the next album or tour. David generally agreed with this line of thinking, but only to a point. Rather than disappear completely, as if that was possible, he suggested the band record and release just one song early in the new year, and release it as a standalone single. Theoretically, this would keep both fans and critics at bay for a while Edward continued to craft brilliant and ambitious songs, and everyone recovered from the brutal schedule of the previous years. Opting for the path of least resistance, David suggested the band simply cover a popular song, putting a Van Halen spin on an established product. If this was lazy thinking, it was also somewhat shrewd. After all, Van Halen's first hit single was a cover of The Kinks' "You Really Got Me." If the strategy worked in 1978, why wouldn't it work in 1982? It was simply a matter of finding the right vehicle. David was a cynical, as his later musical direction would prove, but sometimes cynicism can be a highly effective marketing tool, at least in the short term. Dave's first suggestion for a cover was "Dancing in the Street," which had been a huge hit for Motown stars Martha Reeves and the Vandellas in 1964, and had been covered multiple times since. Dave gave Edward a copy of the song, and while he knew and liked it, he said, he couldn't quite figure out a way to turn it into a Van Halen song. I get that. Edward was too creative an artist to simply replicate a song, no matter how great it might already have been. He had to personalize it. David's shrieking vocals were his signature, obviously, but to Edward, it was about recasting the song in such a way that it would be unmistakably Van Halen. And that started with the guitar. For whatever reason, Edward rejected Dancing in the Street as a standalone single, and instead suggested another staple from that same year, Roy Orbison's Pretty Woman. The song was recorded in a single day at Sunset Sound, again with Ted Templeman producing, and heaved into the marketplace virtually overnight. I had no expectations for this song, and I'm not sure the band did either. It was intended as merely a diversion, a chance to have some fun with an old song and keep fans satisfied while they waited for a new album of great original material. But a funny thing happened. Pretty Woman quickly gained a foothold on radio stations across the country, and we didn't even have to pay for it, and soon became one of the band's biggest hits, reaching number 12 on the Billboard single charts. Along with the single, the band also released its first concept video. And what a concept. Picture the four guys from Van Halen dressed as, well, an assortment of fictional types. David as Napoleon, Michael as a samurai warrior, Alex as Tarzan, and Edward as a cowboy, looking a lot like the Lone Ranger. Together, this fearsome foursome rescues a damsel in distress from the evil clutches of two little people. Think about that for a moment, and try to remember that political correctness was of little concern to the band in those days. Adding another layer of controversy was the fact the fair maiden in question was actually a female impersonator. For the boys, it was all meant to be in good fun, but it was a head-slapper for many who saw it, in particular MTV Brass, who eventually deemed the video to be of such questionable taste that it was banned by the network. Fans, however, seemed to like it, and it certainly didn't hurt the single in any way. On some level, I suppose, the success of Pretty Woman was cause for celebration. On another level, however, it was something of a disaster. Why? Because a standalone hit single is a lonely beast. It practically begs for companionship. As Pretty Woman climbed the charts, Warner Brothers responded with predictable greed and short-sightedness, saying in effect, hey, we need an album to go along with this single. At first, we all resisted, but the label kept pressuring the band, and eventually, they relented. A compromise of sorts was reached. Since the first single had been a cover, and since the guys hadn't written any new material, then why not do an album consisting primarily of cover songs? In theory, this would take some of the pressure off David, and especially Edward, to come up with new songs on such short notice. In practice, it was a decision that would compromise the band's integrity, make them look a bit too much like money grubbing, and result in an album that has long been the most maligned in the band's catalog, at least from the David Lee Roth era. In short, that album, Diver Down, was everything that the band hadn't wanted, and it was created in a pressure-packed atmosphere that I had promised to help prevent. Frankly, it made me kind of sick. The title and album cover, which depicts the red and white Diver Down flag used to identify scuba excursions on the open water, had little to do with anything happening on the album from a musical standpoint, though David cleverly claimed otherwise. The flag means that there's something going on that's not apparent to your eyes, he told reporters in the wake of the album's release. You put up the red flag with the white slash. Well, a lot of people approach Van Halen as sort of the abyss. It means it's not immediately apparent to your eyes what is going on underneath the surface. Personally, I don't think it was all that deep, but I admire David for putting a positive spin on a lousy situation. You had to give the guy credit for being a gifted slinger of bull. The same aptitude that was evident on stage while delivering impromptu monologues or patter made David a natural promoter too. Maybe there was something to the whole seen versus unseen nonsense, but I also know the title of the album was basically just a sophomoric bit of double entendre. Dive her down. Dive her down. See what I did there? Anyway, in the wake of the album's release and the accompanying bad press, I was busy getting reacquainted with my old friend, Valium. The best that can be said about Dive Her Down is that it is a fun and at times interesting album, and something of a miracle given how quickly it was assembled. Most of the work was done in less than 2 weeks. In the winter of '82, a ridiculous schedule that resulted in an album that runs just a scant 31 minutes. Of the tracks, only 4 are full-length original songs. The rest are either covers, including Dancing in the Street, and a silly little version of the Dale Evans cowpoke standard, Happy Trails. Along with a version of Big Bad Bill, on which Jan Van Halen was recruited to play clarinet, or instrumental tunes that served primarily as a chance for Edward to demonstrate what everyone already knew, that he was the most mesmerizing guitarist in the world. Unfortunately, blistering solos tend to work better in live performance than on vinyl. There was nothing wrong with any of the new material, which included a pair of balls-out rockers, the Full Bug and Hang 'Em High, as well as the more nuanced and ambitious songs, Secrets and Little Guitars. Still, there was no getting around the fact that Dive Her Down seemed sparse and rushed, a sentiment expressed by no small percentage of critics upon the album's April release. Consider this dagger from Rolling Stone. Strip away the 4 cover versions, the 3 brief instrumentals, and the minute-long goof on Happy Trails, and Van Halen's 5th album, Dive Her Down, suddenly seems like a cogent case for consumer fraud. Van Halen, it appears, is running out of ideas. There's more exclosure here than in a shipment of glassware. Harsh, but not inaccurate. And yet, Dive Her Down was a huge commercial success, propelled by the single success of Pretty Woman and the synth pop of Dancing in the Street, a sound that would be expanded and refined on Van Halen's subsequent album, the masterful 1984. Dive Her Down reached number 3 on the Billboard charts and went on to sell more than 4 million albums. Quadruple platinum. Not bad for something knocked off in less than 2 weeks. Still, despite the album's success, or perhaps because of it, Dive Her Down contributed significantly to the steady erosion of the band's fragile chemistry. While David was perfectly content to belt out vocals of cover songs, so long as they became hits, Edward was unhappy, with the impression that the band had compromised its principles. He would have preferred a less successful album of original material to a less inventive commercial album like Dive Her Down. And I don't blame him. As for me, I wanted the band to have both commercial success and brilliant originality. And I know that Van Halen, at its best, was more than up to the task. For every gigantic task that came my way as manager of Van Halen, there were 100 smaller ones, often of a much more personal nature. Some were annoying, some were humorous, some were fulfilling. I never minded because it was all part of the job. In some ways, it was as important to be there to lend a shoulder to cry on as it was to help renegotiate a new record deal. I was a facilitator of opportunities large and small, a fixer of problems trivial and catastrophic. It was all in a day's work. In '82, I helped David with a couple different issues that illustrate this point. The first involved a young lady who had somehow managed to hold David's attention for more than the usual 2 or 3 dates. By this time, our entire group had begun either to embrace or seriously consider the idea of commitment and monogamy. Well, commitment anyway. Edward had married Valerie Bertinelli. Alex had fallen for a well-known and admittedly gorgeous groupie named Valerie Kendall. They were engaged and would soon embark on a short and tumultuous marriage. And Michael Anthony, of course, was married to his high school sweetheart, Susan Hendry, who was every bit his match in the niceness category and who seemed always to have only her husband's best interests at heart. They were an adorable couple, and it's no surprise that their marriage endures to this day. As for me, well, that same year I got engaged to Jan. We were married in '83 and have been together ever since. I'm a lucky guy, and I know it. David, meanwhile, remained a tireless anything that moved, night or day, on the road or at home. Don't get me wrong, I don't begrudge him this. Hell, I think he'd agree with me. He might even take it as a compliment. He worked very hard at it, after all. David didn't want a relationship, and seemed to understand that he would have made for a restless and roguish partner. Imagine my surprise, then, when David showed up at the house I shared with Jan one day, insisting on talking to me about a particular problem. He was completely lathered up, and not merely because he had made the 20-mile trip from his home by bicycle. It seemed that David had fallen for a young lady and wanted to extend their courtship. There was, however, one problem. I just found out I got the clap, David said. This did not surprise me in the least. Getting an STD was practically a rite of passage when traveling with Van Halen. David, like most of the guys, had absorbed a river of penicillin in his butt to stave off the effects of unprotected sex with strangers. I wasn't sure why he was so freaked out about it this time. "What's the big deal?" I asked. "Go see a doctor. You know the drill." David shook his head. "You don't understand. I really like this girl, and I want to keep seeing her, but I'm pretty sure I've given her the clap too." I shrugged. "Yeah, that's probably true, David. What do you want me to do about it?" David leaned in closer, smiled, and put a hand on my shoulder. "Come on, Noel. You're my manager. My friend." Friend? I did not like the direction this was taking. "Get to the point, David." "Okay, I want you to make a phone call for me." "To whom?" He provided the name of the girl with whom he was now infatuated. "And what would you like me to say?" I remained calm in part because I was curious, but also because the entire premise was so ridiculous that I couldn't resist playing along. "You know," David said with a smile, "tell her I love her, and that I want to keep seeing her, and that I'm very sorry, because I probably gave her the clap." Uh-huh. Easy, right? You can do that for me." I looked David square in the eye. He was not kidding, but I wanted him to know that this was well beyond my pay grade, or maybe below my pay grade. Regardless, there were limits to the type and amount of I would shovel. I love Van Halen, and I love my job, but this fell under the heading of unreasonable request. "Sorry, David, I'm not going to do that." His eyes went big and round like a puppy. "Well then, who's going to tell her?" Even now, 5 years into our journey together, when they were one of the biggest bands in the world, these guys could still behave like children. As their manager, one who still did not have a long-term contract, I could be asked to do almost anything, and rarely did I decline. So, as much as I wanted to tell David to off and grow up, in no particular order, instead I went into fix-it mode. "David, I've got a great idea." We were sitting across from each other at the kitchen table. David pulled his chair closer and straightened up. "What? Tell me." "You send her a beautiful handwritten letter along with a dozen long-stemmed roses." David nodded. "What do I say in the letter?" "Tell her how much she means to you. Tell her you were with someone else before you met her. That's very important. And unfortunately, you contracted something. Be polite and discreet and very apologetic. Remember, she likes you. She doesn't know you're a..." David smiled. "You don't think so?" "Well, she probably does, but for now, she doesn't care." "Yeah," David said. "I'll get on it. Thanks, Noel. You're the best." When David left, Jane came into the room. "What did he want?" she asked. I shook my head. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." Banging heads with bootleggers was more our speed, and we continued to do that with enthusiasm and vigor. Pat Kelly and I had gotten it down to a science by '82. Pat was a former Chicago cop who was head of our merchandising operation. We'd walk around the venue well ahead of the time, look for rogue vendors, and then swoop down on them. We had the legal system working on our behalf by this point, so most of our confrontations were far less violent than they had been in the early days. We'd simply hand a court-ordered notice of confiscation, which gave us the right to take possession of all unlicensed merchandise. We'd take the gear, t-shirts mostly, then bag 'em, tag 'em, and put 'em in storage. One day we were driving around outside the venue when we spotted a man and a woman selling t-shirts near the side of the road. It was a very small operation, just the two of them getting ready to sell a small amount of stock off a card table. But that's the way it often worked. Unlicensed vendors would set up shop at concerts, armed with just enough merchandise to move quickly, maybe a few dozen shirts. Then they'd shut down and turn their earnings over to the bootleggers, keeping a cut for themselves. On this particular day, as we passed the man and woman with the card table, Pat did a double take. "Hey, I know that guy." So we parked the car a short distance away and walked up to the table. The man turned white as soon as he spotted Pat, because he knew he was about to get busted and lose his income for the day. We moved in on them and gently pulled the man aside, while leaving the young woman to continue with her work. You see, we weren't really interested in confiscating such a small number of shirts. Instead, it was Pat's idea to coerce the guy into giving up information about his distributor. In this case, an whole named Johnny, one of the biggest bootleggers around. We knew ahead of time that this was one of his dates and that he would be selling his merchandise all over the place. Every time Johnny showed up at a Van Halen concert, it was with a couple of vans, each filled with at least 500 t-shirts, which he'd sell for $10 a piece. But I'll give the guy this much. He was good at his business. Not just the selling of bootleg merchandise, but doing it without getting caught. We could never seem to find him, so we always ended up settling for busting a few of his vendors. Tonight would be different. "This guy," Pat said. "Let's use him to get to his boss. We scared the out of this guy. First, took him and his partner to a secluded area in a parking deck a short distance away. We told the young woman to sit tight while we led her partner away. Then, we made him think we were not only going to take his merchandise, but maybe rough him up a bit as well. Not that we threatened him, we just looked at him in an unfriendly way, if you get my meaning. 'Look, you're going to be okay,' I said to him. 'We aren't even interested in you.' 'Really?' 'Yeah, really. Just tell us where Johnny is keeping his van, and we'll let you sell your shirts. If your information is good, we'll even give you an extra $500. The man stopped trembling. He smiled warily. 'Are you with me?' Pat shook his head. 'Not yet, but we might.' 'No, that's okay.' And with that, he proceeded to tell us exactly where we could find Johnny's van. 'Great,' I said. 'After the show and after we do the bus, just come by and we'll give you your money.' 'Thanks,' he said before turning to walk away. Suddenly he stopped and doubled back. 'Problem?' Pat asked. The man rubbed his chin with a bony hand. He looked around conspiratorially. 'Yeah, I was just thinking. What do I tell my girl up there? I don't want her to know I made a deal with you. Might get back to Johnny.' I looked at Pat. He nodded. The guy had a point. 'Tell you what,' I said. 'We'll beat you up.' The man recoiled in fear. 'What?' 'Relax,' I said. 'I mean, we're going to make it seem like we beat you up. You know, forced you to give us information.' The man nodded. 'Ah, okay. Good thinking.' Then Pat and I proceeded to smack our hands together and hit each other on the back while our victim cried out in pain, just loudly enough for his partner to hear. After a few minutes, we escorted him out to meet her. He squeezed out a couple tears, and off they went. Later that evening, with local police and marshals in tow, we confronted Johnny selling hundreds of bootleg t-shirts out of the back of his van, and oh man, was he pissed off. It was one of the highlights of my career, hunting bootleggers to see that piece of being hauled away in handcuffs, screaming at the top of his lungs. 'Monk, I'm gonna you to death, you mother!' he screamed as they dragged him off. Later that night, our young informant stopped by to collect his fee. I counted out $500 and placed it in his palm. The guy smiled. Then I handed him an extra 100. He had earned it. Sometimes the boys were their own worst enemies. Even after 5 years of stardom, they still had moments where they would display business naiveness and overall immaturity. Between the tour and merchandise and record sales, we cleared nearly $10 million in 1982. Split that 5 ways, take out 50% for taxes, and you're still left with almost $1 million per man. And as good a year as the 82 was, it could have been even better, at least for one member of the band. In 1982, Michael Jackson went into the studio to begin recording Thriller. At some point in the process, Quincy Jones, the album's producer, reached out to Edward and asked if he would be interested in writing and playing a guitar solo for one of the tracks. That song was Beat It. Like just about everyone else on the planet, Edward had enormous respect for Michael, and like most musicians, he knew that Quincy was an extraordinarily gifted and influential producer. In short, Edward was flattered that he was asked to contribute something to that record. As a fan, I could appreciate that. As a businessman, I had to advise him to consider the parameters of this arrangement very carefully. I don't know whether Edward was offered a royalty for his contribution. I do know that he neither requested nor received a penny. In fact, he insisted on donating his time for free and was quite proud to have done so. Me? I thought he was a idiot. A nice idiot, but an idiot nonetheless. 4 times Edward was in my office to talk about this project, and each time I told him the same thing. For God's sake, Ed, just take a point, or even half a point. He would smile that stoner smile of his and dismiss me with a wave of the hand. Nah, man, can't do that. I love Michael. Yeah, I know, everybody loves Michael, but trust me, he's not working for free, and if this album becomes a big hit, you're going to wish you hadn't given away your time. My warning fell on deaf ears. Edward donated his time and talent, and his contribution helped make Beat It one of the signature songs on one of the decade's signature albums. By the time Beat It was released in April 1983, Thriller had already spawned 2 hit singles in Billie Jean and The Girl Is Mine. Beat It became a platinum-selling single, a massively popular video, a Grammy winner for Record of the Year, and helped catapult Thriller to an unprecedented level of artistic and commercial success. It was nothing short of a transformative song. Thriller, meanwhile, went on to become the best-selling album in history, with sales of more than 30 million. You don't have to be a genius to see that even a small royalty rate on the single and album would have netted Edward a very nice payday. But he was happy to do a favor for someone he admired, and he secured his place in history. So I guess that's something. I just hope it was enough. Likewise, success had not put an end to the conflict that Edward and Alice could provoke in each other. One night in October, we were staying at the Statler Hilton, also known as the Hotel Pennsylvania in Manhattan. We had just come from a show in Pittsburgh and were getting ready for another show in New Jersey. At roughly 2 in the morning, my phone rang. To my surprise, it was Edward, sounding strangely quiet. He said that there had been an accident, and he was in a lot of pain. "Can you come over?" he said. "I'll explain." Edward's room was right next door to mine, so within a minute or 2, I was standing over Edward as he sat on a couch, bent over, clutching his right hand. "Ow! Oh!" he wailed. "Calm down, Ed," I said. "Just tell me what happened." "Al came over with his groupie girlfriend and stepped all over my guitar pieces." I looked down at the floor, which was littered with tiny screws and assorted guitar parts. This was not an unusual sight in Edward's room. He often would take his guitar apart and then reassemble the pieces. He liked to tinker almost as much as he liked to play. "No big deal, Ed. We can pick everything up and get back to work putting it together again. Come on, I'll help you." "That's the problem," Ed explained. "Al stepped on the rug and scattered some of the pieces where I can't find them." He paused. I knew the other shoe was about to drop. "Then I got so pissed I Punch the wall! I watched as Edward cradled one hand inside the other. How bad? I asked. He took a couple slugs of vodka and said, Well, that wall is not sheetrock. It sure wasn't. It was good old New York brick wall. Built in 1919, the Statler's walls were as solid as Edward's guitar playing. He was obviously in a lot of pain. Can you hold a guitar pick? I asked. Edward shrugged. I don't know. There were 3 or 4 picks on the floor, which I gave to him. To my horror, he couldn't close 2 fingers around the pick, and we had a show that night. The more Edward tried to grasp the pick, the more pain he exhibited. Obviously, he wasn't faking. We got to get you to a hospital, I said. Edward dropped his head. I'm sorry. I called Eddie Anderson, head of security, to come down to Edward's room. About 5 minutes later, he came to the door, looking as though he didn't have a care in the world. You won't be smiling when I tell you what's happened, I said, closing the door behind us. Then he saw Edward, moaning in pain. Oh my God, what happened? Ed fought the wall, and the wall won. You know, Edward shouted, it really hurts. By now it had become obvious that there was not going to be a Van Halen show that night, and since Ed's injury had not really stemmed from an accident, we would have to pay for all the advertising, promotion, and any other costs involved. Before I faced that nightmare, though, we had to get Edward to a hospital. Fortunately, since it was the middle of the night, the hotel lobby was quiet. As we exited the stairway into the lobby, I got an idea. Okay, right. Here is where you tripped on that second step of this ratty rug. Edward looked perplexed. Huh? That's where you tripped and fell forward, breaking your fall with your hand. Got it? What do you mean? Look, Ed, it's simple. You didn't fight with the wall. You tripped on the rug. I looked at Eddie Anderson. You understand, right? Finally, it began to sink in. I explained that if Edward injured his hand accidentally by tripping and falling, the band would not be liable for expenses incurred as a result of canceling the show. But punching a wall? That would be a problem. I tipped the cab driver an extra $20 to get us to the emergency room in a hurry. We were lucky. The ER was just about empty except for a couple drunks and a guy who seemed to have been stabbed. He was holding a wet and stained towel over his side. We waited maybe a half hour before a young doctor examined Ed and ordered some x-rays. Good news, he said. Nothing's broken. But he does have a badly sprained wrist. Just give it some rest. The doctor recognized Edward, as did the 2 starstruck nurses who were helping him. If Edward had wanted, he probably could have had both nurses continue their care back at the hotel. On this night, though, he wasn't interested. He was in too much pain. Downhearted, we headed back to the hotel. The doctor had prescribed some pain meds for Ed. Between this and the vodka, Ed was soon feeling no pain. As he started to nod off, I told him to call me if he needed anything. Remember, I'm right next door. Thanks, Edward said. I'm fine. I left Ed's room and went into mine. My phone started ringing almost immediately, despite the fact it was almost 5 o'clock in the morning. Who the could that be? I picked up the phone. A woman's voice said, Hi, Noel. What's going on with Ed? I recognized the voice, but couldn't put a name to it. Who is this? It's Lisa. How you doing? Now I remembered. It was Lisa Robinson, a reporter generally regarded as the queen of rock and roll gossip. I'm fine, Lisa. What can I do for you? You can tell me how Edward hurt his hand. I wanted to be mad at her, but mainly I just had to admire the fact that she had somehow gotten this information so quickly. She must have had sources everywhere, including at local hospitals. Ed's fine, I said. But what about the sprained wrist? We were so looking forward to seeing the band. At that point, I figured Lisa was as good a person as any to help me get my side of the story out. So I told her that Edward had tripped on a rug while walking down the lobby stairs, and that he had injured his wrist trying to break his fall. Really? She said. That's it? That's it, I said. A really unfortunate situation. We might even have to cancel the Meadowlands show. Oh, that's too bad. Yeah, well, when the hits the fan, everybody gets splattered. But that's the whole story, and you got it first. We ended up canceling 3 shows because of Edward's injury, and he even wore a brace on his right wrist for a while afterward. And while we later modified the story to suggest that Edward hurt his hand while horsing around in his hotel room, no one ever found out the real reason behind the injury. Well, that's the end of Chapter 13. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 13 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.